Behavioral interviewing is hot these days. A variety of employers are using behavioral interviewing, including employers in the public sector, in government, in the corporate sector, and also in healthcare. I'm finding, however, that many of my clients don't understand what behavioral interviewing is all about and how to best handle a behavioral interview. For the next several minutes, we're going to talk about exactly that. We're going to discuss behavioral interviewing and how you can best prepare yourself for and handle a behavioral interview situation. Among the topics we'll talk about is exactly what is behavioral interviewing. We'll define exactly what it's all about. We'll talk a little bit about why employers are using behavioral interviewing. Why is it a good strategy for them? And why can it also be a good strategy for you as a candidate? We'll talk about where behavioral interview questions come from. They don't just fall out of the sky. There is a strategy behind behavioral interview questions. We'll spend some time talking about how you can best prepare for a behavioral interview, because the secret is preparation is your key to success, and I will give you some specific strategies around how you should prepare. And finally, we'll discuss how you should answer behavioral interview questions. There are many strategies around how you can best answer those questions. So in thinking about behavioral interviewing, I thought it might be a good idea to go to the dictionary and actually find a definition of behavior. Part of the definition that I found really resonated, and that part of the definition said the response of an individual, group, or species to its environment. And really, what behavioral interviewing is about how you have responded to your work environment in the past. How have you responded to problems, challenges, issues that have come up in the work environment, and those specific examples. So that definition serves us very well. So let's start off by discussing exactly what behavioral interviewing is. And behavioral interviewing is based on the premise that the best predictor of future behavior or future performance is past behavior or past performance. Exhibiting a skill that you need to use in a future job, the best indicator of how you'll use that skill is how you've used it in the past. And so the questions are based on the job competencies for the position that you're interviewing for. And an interviewer is going to be probing, going to be looking for specific past examples of how you've displayed those competencies and those skills. So the question on your mind might be, well, why behavioral interviewing? Why do employers use it? Why should I be interested in it? Well, the bottom line is that behavioral interviewing leads to better hiring decisions. And doesn't that work best for both us as candidates and also for the employer if the decision is made based on objective criteria rather than impressions? So because behavioral questions are based on job-related competencies and they use past experiences or past evidence to show that you've mastered those competencies, they really result in better, more objective hiring decisions, and that benefits both you and the employer. So let's talk next about where behavioral questions come from. And to do that, the best thing to do is to take a look at some competencies, some sample competencies, and then take a look at some questions that address those competencies. The first competency that we'll take a look at is client service or customer service. And so suppose that customer or client service is particularly important for a particular position. Well, a sample question, a sample behavioral question, might be something like, describe a situation in which you went the extra mile to please a client. Now think about how that question is structured. It's not what would you do if you had to go the extra mile to please a client. It's think about a situation in the past where you went that extra mile to please that client. Specific past evidence with a specific past example. Suppose another competency was self-management, how you handle yourself in the workplace. A sample question might be, tell me about a professional risk that you took and what was the outcome. Not what would you do if you had to take a risk and what would you hope would happen. Very hypothetical. But if you're forced to describe that professional risk from the past and what the outcomes were, that really shows that you have developed mastery of this competency. In some situations, the employer may tell you, I'm going to be using a behavioral interviewing format today, and I want you to know that straight up front. In other scenarios, the interview may be sprinkled with some behavioral questions, and you need to be listening very carefully and identify those questions as they come up. So there are some sample starters that you should be listening for that will help you identify behavioral questions. Some of those sample question starters might be, tell me about a time, think back to a situation, describe an experience. All of those are hints that the employer is looking for you to go back and talk about a specific situation or a specific experience in the past that shows that you have that particular skill or competency. So now that we've taken a look at where behavioral questions come from and you have an idea of how you can identify behavioral questions, let's talk for a few minutes about how you should prepare for a behavioral interview. I truly believe that preparation is everything, and if you prepare for behavioral questions, you will ace those questions when you actually get into the interview situation. I have a few very basic strategies that will ensure that you're as well prepared as you possibly can be for a behavioral interview question. The first thing that you really should do is get the job description from the employer and review that job description carefully. You need to know every element of that job description. I personally like to actually print the job description out, and then I like to go through and look for the key skills or the key competencies that really appear important to this particular job. Suppose you see a skill or a competency that is mentioned in the description maybe 2 or 3 times. That's a good indicator that it is a key skill or a key competency that you're likely to be asked about during the interview. My strategy with this is very low tech. I take out a highlighter and I go through that job description and I just highlight all of the skills and all of the competencies that appear important to the job. And in that way, I can think about them and how my background relates to those skills and competencies. The next step should be to review your resume and look for specific experiences in the past where you've used or exhibited those skills or competencies. That way you'll be able to weave a story, and part of this really is about storytelling. You'll be able to weave a story about how you used that skill in some sort of past work experience, and it will support the information that is detailed in your resume. And that's also part of knowing that resume backwards and forwards. The last part of preparation and the most key part of preparation is practicing, and practicing out loud. Absolutely critical. Whether you practice in front of the mirror, whether you practice in front of a friend or colleague, maybe in front of your spouse or your significant other, you need to practice your answers to those questions out loud. And kind of feel and hear those words come out of your mouth so that you're well prepared with that example that shows how you've used that competency or that skill in the past. The practice and the practice out loud is absolutely critical. You must do that out loud. Even if a skill comes up that you haven't prepared for, by preparing for the major skills and competencies that you've identified, you'll have that strategy in the back of your head and you'll much better be able to answer a question, even if it's one that you haven't prepared for. When you get into the actual interview situation and answer those behavioral questions, I think it's a good idea to have a structured format so that you don't kind of wander all over the place with your answers. A format helps you be concise, and a format really helps you be centered on the information that the employer needs. I personally like the STAR format. It's an acronym that's really easy to remember, and it really helps give you some structure and really helps you stay on track as you answer those interview questions. The S in STAR stands for situation. What was the specific, relevant situation that you were faced with when you used or exhibited this skill or competency? The T stands for task. What was the overall task that you needed to address in this particular situation? What was the big thing that you needed to do in order to answer the situation or answer the problem? The A stands for the specific actions that you took, the steps that you took in order to complete the task. That really helps a potential employer because it gives him or her an idea of how your mind works and how you structure yourself when you're putting together a plan to solve a problem or complete a task. Very valuable information. Finally, what were the end results? What was the end result or the end outcome? Employers, whether they are government, whether they're in healthcare, or whether they're in the corporate sector, they are very interested in results. And so being sure that you're able to specifically articulate that R piece, that result piece, what were the final results, what were the final outcomes, that's an absolutely key part of the equation. So we've briefly talked about the concept of behavioral interviewing. We've talked about why it's important, why employers use it. We've talked about where behavioral questions come from. I've given you an idea of how to best prepare for a behavioral interview. And finally, I've provided you with a template that will help you structure your answers to behavioral interview questions. I'm confident that you have the skills you need to go out and ace your next behavioral interview. Thanks for joining me.